We begin tonight with the breaking news that we just heard from the Pentagon. With me now on the phone from Iraq is NBC News national security and Pentagon correspondent Courtney Kube. Also with me is former CIA Director John Brennan, who was in the Situation with President Obama during the mission that killed Osama bin Laden. He's also an MSNBC national security analyst. And on the phone is also Ned Price, former senior director and spokesperson for the National Security Council under President Obama. Let me start with you, Courtney. The military released some of this footage, some of the footage of showing that the compound is no longer a shrine. But it was in a limited amount of footage. Why did they feel this was necessary?
Well, so, I mean, for starters, because President Trump came out initially and gave a lot of details about this and then started promising some photos and videos or even teasing the idea we might get it, it sort of boxed the military into having to do something. You know, I think everyone was hoping that we would see some sort of video from the K-9 or something of it actually being Baghdadi. What we saw was still, you know, good video, interesting, the compound initially, and then the airstrike that destroyed it, you mentioned, and which is very standard, the kind of video that we see out of the U.S. military in strikes and raids. But we never. No.
Yeah, I lost Courtney there on the phone. Sorry, Courtney, I'm going to let you pause, let that signal recycle itself a bit. John Brennan, I remember very vividly you coming into the White House briefing room, I think that was the day after the bin Laden announcement, giving us some detail. Help viewers here a little bit. They've seen the footage that we've seen. How much footage will we never see, but still exists?
Well, Chuck, first of all, I think General McKenzie did an excellent job as far as describing factually what happened at the compound. And they released the footage with due consideration to protecting sources and methods and the various tactics that they use when prosecuting these assaults against compounds. So I think they tried to lean as far forward as possible. But at the same time, there is still ISIS members out there, and the U.S. military operates in that area. And so I think they were very cautious, as they should be, about releasing anything that might give the ISIS members clues about what to look for some type of future raid. So, again, I think they probably went as far as they could, and General McKenzie's description, I think, tried to fill out some of those gaps.
All right. Well, again, I want to go. It is, to me, it's always remarkable how much footage we do have. So I guess I'm curious, how much footage will we never see? But the Pentagon has, is there even, I think Courtney's right. There was an expectation. Probably some viewers think, oh, we're gonna see footage of a GoPro on the dog that chased down al-Baghdadi. Obviously, that isn't what we're going to see. But what kind of footage is there that we're not seeing that does exist?
Well, some really interesting footage, Chuck, that you and the viewers are not going to be able to see. It's because the need to protect these capabilities. So there's a lot of things that happened during the bin Laden raid that will never see the light of day. Same thing is true here with the Abu Bakr Baghdadi raid. So there are things that happen on the ground, up close and personal. So it's either to protect source and methods or with due consideration about not providing, a very horrific scene that includes a lot of bloodshed. That suicide murder bombing by Baghdadi, I'm sure that was awful. Whether or not there's any footage of it, I don't know. But if there is, it's appropriate for the government not to release something like that. I think we have to try to make sure that we're not going to do anything that is going to further provoke maybe the sensitivities in that region.
Let me go back to Courtney, who's in Iraq. We got the connection recycled a bit and should be better. Courtney, the Pentagon seemed to confirm that they've extracted 2 people who have been detained. They wouldn't confirm whether one of them is the informant. They talked about children that were extracted. But where are they? Are they in American custody, or are they in the custody of another group, another entity? Kurds, where are the children that have been extracted? Are they still in our custody?
No. So according to a senior U.S. military official, they were turned over right away to some capable party is all we've been told. The way that I kind of took the explanation that we got about it was that they turned them over to someone who was nearby. And that was it. They never took the children into any kind of custody.
What does that mean, nearby?
Really interesting. Well, we don't really know. I mean,
wow.
You look at the photos of that compound, it doesn't look like there are any neighbors nearby. And in fact,
no.
General McKenzie just now specifically said that that they don't believe. Remember, this is not an ISIS area where he was found in this part of Idlib province. In fact, there's some competing groups.
It was an
Al-Qaeda,
right? An Al-Qaeda newsroom? Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
Sorry.
But McKenzie said two very interesting things, that other militant groups didn't know that Baghdadi was there and that he'd been there an extended period of time. Now, we've been hearing that there was concern that he was maybe about to move, and that was one thing that sort of gave them the incentive to have to go, that they knew the layout of this particular compound. It's clear, General McKenzie said they knew there were children there as well. So they had a good situational awareness of this, and I think that was one of the reasons, including, some of the basic things. Like, look, I'm here in Baghdad right now. There's weather, particularly this time of year. It's been raining and low cloud cover and whatnot. They need to factor those kinds of things in before they do a risky mission like this. And it sounds like one of the incentives that they had was Baghdadi had been there an extended period of time, and they were concerned that he might leave.
Ned Price, one of the things that the General McKenzie also said is, look, as ISIS tries to reform itself and decide, figure out who its next leader is, we know the president said they already essentially got the number 2 because he may have been with al-Baghdadi at the time. Walk me through how is it that we track this stuff with ISIS? How well identified is the government? How much have we identified enough members of ISIS that we have an idea of the various people that could end up being leaders of this ideologically driven group?
Well, Chuck, actually, our nation's top counterterrorism official was on Capitol Hill today testifying about just this. He said that the death of al-Baghdadi certainly was a blow to ISIS, but he described ISIS as having a deep bench, even with its leader and its number 2 now deceased in recent days. Look, the United States government, and clearly I'm not privy to its latest classified assessments, but we have a deep reservoir of knowledge of these top terrorist groups. The challenge, however, Chuck, is that, in General McKenzie, I think, referenced this quite well, is that ISIS these days is just about, it's as much about an ideology as it is a group. And so I think we have to think about it in terms of more broadly than who's at the helm, who its director of external planning is, who its director for various subcomponents is. And we have to think about ISIS for the threat its ideology poses and the potential it has to radicalize those who don't even come into contact with it. And frankly, that is the biggest threat we face here in the United States, is not individuals who have trained with ISIS in places like Syria and Iraq, but individuals who may have found a sermon online, who may have been delivered audio tapes, who never had contact but yet have been inspired by the group's leaders, by the group's visions, by the group's poisonous propaganda to undertake attacks in the United States, in Western Europe, in other allied countries.
John Brennan, look, Baghdadi was on the run. He was trying to move. That tells us something that that he didn't. So what does that tell you, that the fact that he was having to essentially do what bin Laden was doing when you guys got him, which is try to keep hiding and hope that at some point he can find refuge?
Well, it shows the results of what basically has been a 5-year effort on the part of the United States and its coalition partners, as well as the Syrian Kurds, as far as dismantling ISIS and rooting it out from those traditional areas that it controlled. And so, as it was pointed out before, he was found in Idlib province, and that is not an ISIS stronghold. It was, in fact, the stronghold of Jabhat al-Nusra, which is al-Qaeda in Syria. But he, I think, felt most secure there because it is outside of the area area of either Syrian control or the Syrian Kurdish control or U.S. forces presence. And so therefore he was burrowing in and he was hiding there. But I think, as General McKenzie said, the United States military has tremendous reach and tremendous capabilities. And combined with intelligence that we were able to locate where he was, they were able to put the people on that target and be able to eliminate the leader of ISIS. And it is going to be disruptive, and especially then the number two as well. Yes, they have other leaders and other commanders and whatever on the ground there, but this is a blow that I think is going to hurt ISIS, and good on the U.S. military and U.S. intelligence for carrying this out.
Before I let everybody go, John Brennan, General McKenzie essentially said, look, there's going to be some sort of retaliation. Now, it may not be effective, and we may be able. What do you fear in retaliation? What does the most likely retaliation look like that would keep you up?
Well, as I think Ned mentioned, ISIS has been able to use that digital environment to be able to reach out across the oceans and across countries and try to encourage people to carry out attacks. They did it quite extensively in Europe. And so, will that happen? Will somebody carry out some type of, lone actor attack in the name of vengeance for Baghdadi? They might do it. But they really have been hurt on the ground. That pressure continues. I'm hoping that the U.S. decision to pull out is not going to allow them to regenerate. But I could see them trying to do something. But it also shows that ISIS has not been 100% destroyed, as some individuals allege. Right. This is going to be a multi-year effort, and it's going to continue. We're never going to completely destroy that ideology and the people who adhere to it. So we have to maintain that vigilance as well as pressure with our partners, particularly our partners in the area.
John Brennan, former CIA director and a NBC News national security analyst. Thank you. Ned Price, also former National Security Council as staffer, as well as a national security analyst for us. And Courtney Kube on the ground in Iraq, our Pentagon correspondent. Thank you all. Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.